Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining the session. And thank you for the patience that you have. Thank you very much. So, in order to begin, I would like to first introduce you to Dr. Naziha. Dr. Naziha, first of all, thank you very much for joining us. It is really appreciated, and thank you for taking up your morning in giving the session to the attendees. So, Dr. Naziha Ali Raza has a professional doctorate from the University of Exeter, UK. She has taught education, research, communication, and English language in the UAE for over 20 years. In 2015, Dr. Raza served as the president of the largest teachers association in the UAE. His Highness Sheikh Al Nahyan awarded her for professional service to teachers in 2012. She's an active researcher in her field, has published on teachers' development research, and is a regular presenter at teachers' education conferences around the world. Thank you very much, Doctor, for being here. And I'll leave the floor all with you.
Thank you, Amro, and good morning, everybody from Dubai, GBS Dubai. It's a pleasure to be here this morning talking to you about a subject that is very close to my heart. So this morning, we are going to talk about mastering communication strategies for leadership success. Communication and leadership are connected, and that is exactly what I'm going to share with you this morning. I would also like to commend you for making the time this morning to focus on learning something new. So first of all, let me share with you what exactly is going to be covered in this 1 hour or 45-minute session. We're going to first look at the need for effective communication, and then try and understand the role of communication in effective leadership in all aspects of our lives. And we will also look at what exactly is the link between effective communication and effective leaders. There are always barriers and blocks in things like these, especially related to communication. So we will have a look at what might be the likely barriers and blocks in helping us communicate effectively. And finally, I'll share some tips to get you going and also leave you with some tools that I've personally used for my own development. So, first of all, it makes sense to start with an understanding of what some research says. Did you know that some research conducted in 2023 says poor communication is responsible for 70% corporate errors in business and business communication. And then this is a huge number where 70% of global employers actually want potential employees to have communication skills or effective communication skills. And this might interest you a little bit more that 74% of recruitment people indicate that digital communication knowledge is more important in this era. Another report highlights that the cost of poor business communication is immense. It includes wasted time, messages that people miss because they haven't been put forward clearly. People get fatigued when they have to go back and forth communicating about things that can be said in a simple manner. And we will look at some ways to do that. And then sometimes files tend to get lost in email, so that's another problem. I've highlighted some things in bold because I'd like us to pay attention to those. These are impactful for any business or in any work environment. All of this results in bad customer experience. 28 is a significant number if it's linked to customers, 28%. And then people or businesses lose their customers to other competitive businesses. And of course, eventually employees leave the company. So the impact of poor or ineffective communication in the workplace is immense, and this is something we need to consider. Now, I'd like us to take a moment to think about ourselves. So, do you consider yourself an effective communicator? What kind of challenges do you think you face in communication? And do you know anyone who you consider to be an effective communicator? Since this is a 1-hour webinar, what I'm going to suggest is when you have any questions or observations to make, please type them in the chat box and I will have a look at them with the help of Amro and the team once I finish my presentation or session this morning. So take a moment to think about these things, and this will help you focus on what I've got planned on the rest of the slides this morning. Now, there is a reason we communicate. One of the reasons we communicate, or there are a couple of reasons why we communicate. So first of all, we want to share something, then we want to build something, then we want to coordinate and collaborate and persuade. What does that mean? We want to share information in our everyday interactions, whether it is at work or elsewhere. We want to build both personal and professional relationships. We want to coordinate and collaborate because there might be a common goal that we're trying to achieve. And perhaps problem solving may not always be negative, but we're looking for solutions. And for that, we need to communicate. And then influence others in their decision making to help people influence others, to help people persuade others. So some of these might be visible in areas such as marketing or leadership or negotiation at the workplace again. I keep referring to workplace because when we talk about effective communication skills, these are most necessary in the workplace. And of course, if you learn them, you're able to practice them in your personal lives as well. So since we're focusing on the purpose of communication, it makes sense to look at why does it matter? Why are we talking about it? Because the purpose of working in a conducive work environment involves building relationships, conveying information appropriately, solving problems, influencing others, as we've said on the previous slides, emotional expression, something that 90% of us find incredibly challenging at the workplace. Education and learning, developing yourselves, cultural understanding, more especially in the Middle East when people work with people from many different cultures and everybody has a different communication style. And also to enable us to be a little bit innovative and creative in our work. You can notice that some of these are highlighted in bold, and I think these are pertinent to effective communication at the workplace, which is why I've highlighted them. While all 8 of them are necessary, those that are highlighted in bold seem to be more pertinent. Now let's look at what are the possible barriers in communicating effectively. So one of the things that stands out is language differences. When you work in a multicultural environment, you're bound to work with people who come from different cultures, have different languages, and may be from the same country but different regions, so you may not always understand each other's language. Now, the problem arises not with those individual languages. The barrier is in the use of the common language. Let's say, in this case, English language. So when people from different cultures or different regions or different linguistic backgrounds work together, then their use of English language varies and their vocabulary varies. So this is a potential barrier because not each party may understand each other. Then there are cultural differences, of course, which refer to things like having a different approach to work, having a different approach to perhaps writing an email or communicating verbally. So this has a significant impact on how people communicate or understand each other. It's not just the person communicating, it's the person receiving as well. Then perceptual barriers, which means you may not see the same thing in the same way because of your linguistic and cultural background. And emotional barriers. Again, this is linked to cultural differences because culturally, people may or may not express emotions verbally or physically in a certain way. We will look at some of these areas when we start talking about emotional intelligence in communication. So while there might be many barriers, the one that stands out the most is the language difference, because often in multicultural workplaces, linguistic barriers are the most common concerns that make communication difficult. So, yes, we've looked at the barriers. Yes, we've looked at the blocks. We've talked a little bit about the need for communication. But why is there so much talk about effective communication? People talk about this all the time in business development and continuous professional development. You're here, so many of you this morning. So what is the hype about effective communication? Well, there is a bit of a difference. As you see, there is something called communication and there is something called effective communication. The difference really lies in how clear you are and how your message is understood. Now, effective communication ensures that the message that you intend to convey to the recipient is conveyed accurately as possible, and that it generates the kind of response that you are expecting to generate, which means you've actually communicated, right? Let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So communication as a process is just exchanging information. You send out information, somebody receives it, you say somebody listens. You express something, somebody acknowledges. It might be speaking, it might be writing, or it might be through some kind of visible body language. But it does not necessarily ensure that the message that you've sent across has been understood as you meant it to be understood. On the other hand, if you look at effective communication, this is the hype about it. So effective communication implies that whatever you've said or written or shared has been clearly understood as you wanted it to be understood. It involves a couple of things now. It's not just writing or saying and then just getting on with life. It involves aspects such as being clear, listening actively. Again, you'll see some difference between listening and active listening, and I will share that with you in a moment. Empathy, and also getting some kind of feedback from the recipient to understand that they understood. So this is a very dynamic area as compared to communication. And again, we've talked about the purposes. So it might be to get some sort of an action from the person who is the recipient of your message. So now, how do we make sure that communication is actually effective? One of the things I always recommend to my business communication course participants or to those seeking advice on communicating effectively, what I recommend is to use the 5 C's, which is the magical backbone of effective communication. If you do a random search on the internet, you're going to see the 10 C's, the 7 C's, the 12 C's, the 17 C's. But if you look at them closely, you will identify that there's 5 core C's of effective communication. What are these? Well, First of all, you look at whether your language is clear. Whether you write or you speak, you need to be aware of the fact whether you use language that is easy to understand. Do you use simple words or do you use fancy words just because you know them, just because they look good on you? I'm a PhD, so there is an expectation that I might use fancy words. But the purpose of my sending messages or talking to people is to have them understand what exactly I want to say. That is effective communication. So I always try to use simpler words in my writing and speaking. So the first C is clear. The second C is concise. I know we always say, and most of us have grown up and being educated with this notion of your language should be clear and concise, but nobody ever tells you how to do it. They just say, make it clear and concise. Well, here are the tips in these questions. So concise means, do I provide information that is specific, or am I just using lots of words to say lots of things in one sentence just because I know the language? So try to be as specific as possible. Do I use sentences in my speaking and writing that are very, very long, or do I try to stick to the point? Oftentimes we use a lot of repetition in our writing and speaking. So we might say, for example, what are your future plans? Does it occur to you that plans might always be in the future? So anything that is planned is for the future. So it's enough to say, what is your plan? Instead of, what are your future plans? That's an extra word there. So that's not concise. Complete, the third C. Do I include answers to most of these questions? When you were at school, you probably learned these: who, what, when, where, why, and how. There was a reason behind that, and you can discover that today. Complete information is necessary in order to reduce burnout and fatigue between colleagues. So if you send an email that does not contain all the necessary information, you're likely to get back another email that says, so what was it that you were trying to say? Or I don't understand this. That means you send a third email and then the person sends another email. All of this can be reduced when you include the appropriate information in one single email. So always try to make sure that the 5 W's and the H are answered in your communication. The next thing you might want to look at is correct, the fourth C. How do I use my grammar? Is it correct? How do I use my spelling? Are they correct when I write? Do I use punctuation in the right places? That's all referring to correct. There's a word for everything that's incorrect in this box called correct. It's called mechanics. This is when you have finished typing something and then you proofread it one more time. That's when you check whether your grammar, spelling, and punctuation are all correct. And then you can just tick the C off. The last C is courteous, something that we unintentionally overlook in our communication. So you've done all the clear, concise, complete, and correct. But have you paid attention to the kind of vocabulary you use? Is it too emotional? Is it subjective, expressing your own personal opinions? Do you use capital letters to highlight things? Do you use bold font to highlight things like you see on my slide at the moment? Or do you use red font to make people pay attention to what you're trying to say? So some of these things are a no-no. In any business communication or effective communication classes or courses that you take, you will be taught not to use these in writing because capitals and red look like you're shouting at the person. So the best thing is to really avoid that. And then nowadays, or in the last 10 to 15 years, writing as well as speaking has become more focused on courtesy in the sense of gender biased language. Do you remember perhaps in your school books, or maybe when people in certain contexts talk to you, they often say, God made man, he is a good boss, or when they refer to a certain type of an individual, they use the gender he or she. Oftentimes I notice that people say, teachers work really hard. She is, they use the term she for teacher, assuming that only a female can be a teacher. So in understanding both contexts, gender biased language is considered inappropriate in professional communication. It is always safer to use the term they if you're using a generic statement. So God made human beings. Nobody in modern professional communication, people do not say chairman or they just remove the gender. They just say chairperson, and a job for humans, for people. So the term male and female is pretty much diminished in modern day communication. Often people just use the term they instead of he and she. And this has become a part of school-based English grammar classes as well now. Also, I noticed that people sometimes use exclamation marks in their emails. And again, that gives the notion of you shouting at the individual that you are writing to. So exclamation marks are a complete no. It's always wiser to use a full stop. Informal communication and writing, yes, you can use exclamation marks because you're probably writing to a friend using WhatsApp text. So here, since I brought up WhatsApp, the good thing to do in making sure that your communication is understood the way you would like it to be understood is to avoid WhatsApp language. So try and use English that you would not use in a WhatsApp text message. So these are the 5 C's, and they're the magical backbone of effective communication. Clear, concise, complete, correct, and courteous. This is something that you should always remember. Here's an example from written communication. I like to talk more about written communication because that is often where the person's face is not visible and therefore messages get misinterpreted. So here you send an email to a colleague, for example, and there is a report attached to your email, and that's it. You don't say anything in the email. It's just an email with a report attached. Well, your colleague is not going to open it or read it carefully. That's 90% chance that they're not going to do that because it doesn't seem important. It's just an attachment and they can see the name of the attachment. They'll look at it later. Now, you send an email that has a subject line mentioning the name of the report, and in the body of your email, you say something like a greeting, and then you say, here is the report, which summarizes A, B, and C. And then a couple of hours later, you just call up your colleague and say, well, I just sent that earlier in the morning. Did you get a chance to look at it? And this is more effective because chances are that if there was a subject line and a quick summary, they did open it, they did look at it, and then they didn't respond to you, maybe because they were busy, but when you call them, they're going to say, yes, I did, and by the way, I think so and so, and the job gets partly or mostly done. So that is the power of effective communication. There's a big difference in the way the 2 emails are done. This happens in verbal communication as well. People often talk to each other and then they just pop into your room or just come to you and say, so what did you think of that? And half the time you won't know what did you think of what. So the more clarity you use, as I showed on the previous slide, the more clarity you use, the more concise you are, the more complete your information is, the easier it is to get a response that you are looking for. So I hope this example was helpful. Now, at the start of the session, I mentioned something about leadership and good leaders and effective communication and strategies. So we're going to look very briefly at what exactly does a good leader do? Why are we talking about leaders anyway in a communication workshop? Now, again, if you research the internet or if you look up the literature on leadership talk, you will find some qualities that leaders are expected to have. They're expected to build trust between teams. They're expected to develop their own credibility. They're expected to set clear expectations with the people they work with. Leaders are also expected to encourage collaboration within their teams. They're expected to inspire people who work with them or for them and motivate them to do certain things. They are also expected to give feedback, receive feedback, and be adaptable, as well as manage, change, and build effective relationships. Now, all of this is really possible through communication. Let us take this one more step seriously and say it's not just communication. All of these are possible through effective communication. When you look at this list, can you think of any leaders that you know who are effective communicators? Here are some that I've got listed. I wanted to see what these leaders bring to the communication agenda. So I got pictures on this slide, so I'll share this with you. The previous slide just had names. You might want to see their faces if you don't know one or two of them, because we all live in different countries. So the first one that stood out was Michelle Obama, the wife of one of the past presidents of the United States. What stands out in her communication style is that she used personal stories, little narratives from her life. Every time she made a speech, she would include a little story from her life and her own personal experiences. So that says something about how she personalizes communication. Then Oprah Winfrey. I'm sure a lot of you might know about her. Her communication style stands out because she is an empath, a person who genuinely listens to other people without giving an opinion. The third person that I identified is Martin Luther King Jr. Now, he had a technique in his public presentations or speeches. It's called the anaphora. He repeated the same phrase multiple times at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end of his speeches. The intention was to make people remember what he is saying. In one of his speeches called I Have a Dream, it's a very famous speech. He used this technique 8 times. So he repeated the phrase I have a dream 8 times through his speech, which means people remembered it. He was reinforcing something. He was trying to make a point, and it stayed with listeners. Another very interesting person that fell into my list is Winston Churchill. From many years ago, a prime minister in the UK. His strategy of making people remember what he said or being an outstanding communicator was to use short sentences but powerful sentences. So I've got a quote or two here. So one of the things he said was, success is not final, failure is not fatal, it is the courage to continue that counts. And then attitude is a little thing that makes a big difference. So things that inspire people. Now, all of these communicators, the examples I chose are because they did things in verbal communication that people remembered. There's also something about Bill Clinton, another American president, in the way he used his body language or non-verbal gestures, which were not too dramatic. You know how sometimes some of us use our hands, facial expressions. So there's a couple of things that are linked to verbal communication that make you an effective or an ineffective communicator. I've taught a lot of communication skills in both writing and verbal oral communication, and I know I remember an example where one person would continually touch his thigh, and that was so distracting. People would stop listening and they would start observing the fact that he was continually fiddling with his thigh. So that's a part of body language. The example just came into my mind, so I'm sharing that with you. So now we've established a link between effective leaders and some of the ways in which they communicate, which make them stand out, and people remember to this day, long after they've moved away from those roles. So we have to look at some things that stand out in terms of effective communication. We've already talked a little bit about clear and concise messaging. I've mentioned a little bit about non-verbal communication, emotional intelligence, an incredibly exciting thing that we are aware of, but we don't really handle it in a way that helps our communication become outstanding. So we'll talk about that. And then storytelling, this is what I told you about Michelle Obama, little anecdotes, and adapting your style, and then active listening. I deliberately referred to active listening at the end, and you notice that it is a little bit outside my diagram. There's a reason. So active listening is incredibly important. We listen all the time, but we do not do active listening. So let us first start with the art of active listening, which is by far the most important thing in communication. Communication is less about speaking, but is more about listening when it's an in-person communication. We talked a little bit about writing communication a few minutes ago, but now we'll focus on in-person communication. So, what does active listening mean? It means you fully concentrate, understand, respond, and remember what is being said. And having practiced that, I feel that it takes a lot less effort to remember things when you practice active listening as compared to talking to people, listening to them with an eye on the mobile, or trying to write something, or thinking about other things. So 100% focus of being mindful of what is being said is a big challenge in today's world. And often when people are talking at meetings, workplace meetings, or even in discussions in any context, the listener is always thinking of, okay, let him finish, let her finish. What am I going to say next? So if you're not thinking about that, then you're actually practicing active listening. How do you do it? That is the big question. Everybody says listen actively, but how do you do it? So first of all, maintain eye contact with the speaker. Very important. That way you're acknowledging them. Avoid interrupting when they speak. This is a skill that 99% of us need to practice because sometimes we're so excited or sometimes we're so restless and wanting to do the next thing. We always interrupt without allowing the person to finish what they're saying. Acknowledge and empathize through non-verbal techniques. So this is where your body language comes in. How do you do that? So first of all, when you're practicing non-verbal techniques, you might want to continue looking at the person, nod your head a little bit, smile a little bit if something pleasant is being said, or just sometimes people lean a little forward to demonstrate that they're listening. And then restate what the speaker has said to confirm your understanding. So when it's question and answer time, for example, so you might want to say, so you said this, am I understanding this right? So restate what they've said, and then summarize briefly the key points of what was communicated. So you don't need to say everything. This is another strategy. So perhaps when you're asking a question, you could say, so you said we should maintain eye contact, avoid interrupting, and emphasize through body language. However, I noticed that you didn't say anything about speaking, for example. So you've summarized the key points and then you've asked a question. That's another strategy. And then you can also ask clarifying questions. So you might want to say, well, I understood that part, but I didn't understand how I'm supposed to practice speaking in a workplace context. So could you please give some information on that? So the last 3 points that I've shown you on the slide are about verbalizing some part of the speaker's conversation to be able to demonstrate that you were listening, and therefore you might want to understand something else. The first 3 points are about your body language, and I've given you examples of how that can be done, how to demonstrate that you're listening actively. It looks simple on the slide, but believe me, it takes a lot of practice to be able to actually do that. Because in today's world, we're all so distracted. It is impossible to spend 5 minutes without touching the phone because you might have received a text message from somebody that you want to read. So we're all continually distracted in the digital age. So that was listening. Now, the second thing I'd like to talk about is clarity. So let's practice clarity in our communication. How do we do that? I've shown you those magical 5 C's. Here they are, and you need to continually practice the 5 C's of communication in your writing, in your speaking, in everything that you communicate. So this is just a recap. When you're trying to practice clarity in your communication, use simple language. Avoid jargon, avoid words that are specific to your area of life or work or your region or your context because the other person might not understand it. Be specific, include the necessary information, be direct. Do not use too many words. Do not use repetitive words for the same thing. Provide all the key information. This is where I said you could use the 5 W's and the H. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. Once you've done that, it's not an essay, it's not a thesis. Once you've done that, nobody asks you any more questions unless they really need something else. Also, when you're speaking, make sure that you give the relevant information instead of saying something ambiguous. Correct your spelling and punctuation and the grammar in your written text. Make sure it's correct. And in speaking, correct refers to the accurate pronunciation. So if you're unfamiliar with the language that you are using to communicate, make sure you understand how to pronounce words that you're not familiar with. These days it's easy. You can use the internet to help you pronounce different kinds of words. And courteous, please avoid any kind of subjectivity, any kind of personal bias, and always summarize the key points as a courtesy to the person that you're communicating with. So we've talked about the art of active listening. We've talked about being clear in our communication. Let's see what's next. Now, non-verbal magic. This is not the bigger, it's the biggest challenge after active listening. Oftentimes, our body language unknowingly demonstrates what we do not want to demonstrate. So We need to be aware of how we are being seen by the person who is talking to us. Try and use facial expressions that convey constructive emotions. You might be bored, you might be sleepy, but you need to rehearse, unfortunately, how to appear constructive. So your facial expressions should show something positive. Maintain eye contact. There is nothing more important than maintaining the appropriate eye contact. This is different from staring, so you have to be really careful. There's a thin line. You do not want to be seen as staring at the other person. You want to be seen as making just appropriate eye contact, just to show that you're listening, you're with them. And use gestures that align how you emphasize your message. You see me use a lot of gestures on screen today. I am using gestures to emphasize the points I'm making. I'm not just using random gestures in the air. Also, when you use gestures during your spoken communication, make sure that they're not aggressive. Again, I have a lot of personal stories. This 1-hour webinar is not enough to share all those anecdotes. So I've also seen people who, when they speak in a public presentation, use aggressive gestures, and that seems threatening to the audience. You need to be very careful and be aware of and monitor the tone of your voice. You do not want to be seen as shouting at the people you are communicating with. You do not want to be seen as rude or aggressive. You would like to be seen as someone who's trying to communicate and make a point. So be fully aware of what kind of tone you are using at any time you talk. So that was our third point about body language. This is the fun part as well. Why do we need to consider emotional intelligence? If you remember, I said something about empathy a few slides ago, and I showed you a picture of Oprah Winfrey, one of the celebrities who runs or who used to run a talk show where people talk and she listens. Now, empathy is an incredibly important part of emotional intelligence. You need to explore the power of empathy. We all have it, but we don't always understand what we are doing and how we are feeling about it. You need to be aware of your own emotional state. Understand what makes you feel what way, what makes you angry at the workplace, what is said that makes you emotional? What is it that makes you happy? So be aware of these emotions, and also being aware of your emotions will actually help you manage them better in terms of communication. The trick is to be able to verbalize. Sometimes you may not like what is being said. Then you need to verbalize it and say, I do not agree with this. I do not support what is being said. However, but it's tricky. It's not just about you. You need to acknowledge others as well. And there's a way to do it. You need to practice how you're saying it. All of this will help you communicate objectively without emotion in challenging situations. Emotional intelligence is a very vast field, which includes communication as an important aspect. So a simple example I can leave you with is, if you disagree with something that has been said by a colleague, it is okay to verbalize how you feel, but at the same time acknowledge what they've said. So a statement in a context like this would be, I understand where you're coming from, but I find it difficult to agree to this for these reasons. Make yourself credible, give 1 or 2 reasons. So this thing may look simple as I've said it, but it's a very complex sentence. In this sentence, you've acknowledged the emotion or the stand of your colleague. In this sentence, you verbalize how you feel about that situation or decision. And in the same sentence, you've given 2 or 3 points to provide evidence and support why you feel that way. This is a professional communication situation. It's not a personal aggressive situation, and it works. The response you will get may not be as aggressive as it would have been if you had just said, I don't like what you've said. There's a big difference between the two statements. I can recommend some books other than the most commonly associated name with emotional intelligence is Daniel Goleman. He's written a lot of books. You may want to explore his website to understand a little bit more. There are a couple of new publications on emotional intelligence if it interests you. And I will be happy to share some resources after the webinar through our team here. So that was the fourth point we looked at. Now this is interesting. Anyone who is a good speaker will always have good stories to share, not long stories, brief anecdotes. Anecdotes are like a two-sentence personal story that gives an example of something that is linked to something they're trying to say and make a point of. It's a skill that people practice, and it always makes people interesting to listen to. One of the first speakers that I got inspired with, I do a lot of public conference speeches, but I met a person who totally inspired me, a very well established and experienced educator. And when I went to his room during a session, he started with a story and some gestures with the story. So, and I thought, I'm really listening to this person. This man is making sense. 5 minutes of a personal story before his actual presentation, and we were all quiet and listening to him. And then he started his presentation. The presentation was, the examples that he used in the story were linked to the presentation, and it made the presentation so much more enjoyable. So that's how I got interested in this technique, and that person led me to a secret practicing technique that I'll share at the end. So my point here is, again, like I used a personal story to start this slide. So personal anecdotes show that you're connected to the audience. Choose stories that are related to the topic, no more than 2 sentences long, because you don't want to bore people. Try and give really clear descriptions in what you say, because you've got 2 minutes and the two sentences, sorry, and the 2-sentence pitch has to be the best, something that people will remember. Always make sure that no matter what you say in that story, it supports the points that you are trying to make in the rest of the conversation. So this is an art. Just like active listening is an art, this is an art. You need to work on this to be able to do this, but it definitely makes people pay attention to what you're saying. And also, what is key in verbal communication as well as written communication is you should always be able to adapt your communication style to the person or the audience that you are connecting with. How do you do it? Well, first of all, you need to know a little bit about them. So do your homework. Find out details of the people you're going to talk to or people you're writing a report for. And if you're talking, use a mixed style. If you're writing, use a mixed style. Include some details, some summaries, some visuals. You know, that is what effective teachers do. They cater to all types of learning styles. They try to use images, they try to use activities in class, they try to use lectures, and then maybe videos. So they mix up all styles. And the reason is because they're adapting their communication style to the people that they are teaching or talking to. In an adult learning classroom, you might see a lot of these activities. And so adjust your approach as you become aware. So if you're in a room full of people that you need to talk to for an hour, or if you're with a group of people for 6 months, or if you're going to work with a group of people, adjust your approaches as you get to know them a little bit more. Unfortunately, I can't see everybody on this webinar today, otherwise, and we have just a very brief period of time together. Otherwise, I would be demonstrating some of these communication styles. But consider this a taster session, so you get all the information that you're interested in, and then you can go ahead and explore a little bit more using the resources that I'll leave you with. And also, flexibility is key. So remain flexible based on what you observe. So you should have the confidence to adapt your communication style. Maybe you need to be louder, maybe you need to be lower, maybe you need to use simpler language when you're talking to them. Maybe you need to show pictures instead of speaking. So it really depends on who you're talking to. And then experiment with a variety, the kind of things that I just suggested. Try using everything in your communication approach, a little bit, not too much of anything, a little bit of everything. Again, this becomes better with practice, I promise you. Okay, the need of the day. This is so important, something that we haven't paid a lot of attention to, except during COVID. And then we said, well, COVID is over, we are experts, let's get on with life as usual. But that is not how it is. So very briefly speaking, pay attention to how you write emails. I gave you an example of an email without a subject line, without a body. This week, I'm a faculty, so this week I've received a couple of emails of student assignments with no subject lines, no body, just a blank email with an attachment. So my job is to educate my students. I've responded back to the email saying, could you please send me a subject line and an email to say, what is it that you would like me to do with this? And because I'm faculty, so I get the responses that I want to. So they sent back emails actually writing down what they want me to do with the attachment they've sent me. So I use that trick, but you can't use that with your bosses. So the right way to do it is that you send out an appropriate email. So be mindful of what you put in that email. Video calls. We have some stories there. Video calls and filters, these go together. If you do not recognize that picture that I've got on my slide, I'll fill you in a little bit about what that is. During COVID-19, there was one incident where a group of lawyers in a meeting on Zoom were discussing something. One of them got bored and played around with the filters on Zoom and landed himself in this cat filter. Now, the meeting was on and he could not get out of the cat filter. He didn't realize that everybody would be able to see him. And for the rest of that meeting, he was stuck in that cat filter. And he typed a message to say, I'm not a cat, I am whoever I am. He typed his name. So you can see from this black slide that it's a judicial district court meeting. So when that incident happened, it went viral all over the internet, and then people started talking about appropriate filters that you can use, things that you can do, at what time should you see a filter. Speaking of anecdotes and short stories, I can share one again here. So this was a funny incident, and we discussed this a lot during our professional training sessions. Another one that I can share with you is I was in a professional conference online, and the speaker after me who came online in a room full of thousands of people from all over the world was a male with pink lipstick, and I could see a little red on his cheeks. And I texted the administrator of Zoom to say, what was going on? Is this man wearing makeup or is something wrong? And then, well, we didn't say anything at that time, unfortunately, because the session was immediately in progress. But at the end, the administrator, who was my friend, texted me back to say he was using his wife's laptop. So the wife had put filters on Zoom and he just logged in and started talking. So you need to be, when you're in, the point I'm trying to make is virtual communication, check your filters before you start the session, check what you've got in your background, and make sure you have backup data facility just in case your internet goes off. So we've done a lot of that. For example, this morning, before I logged into the session, I checked the camera, I checked the volume, the team, they are connected with me. We're in the same office, but we connected online to see if everything was in place. So you need to be ultra careful, if I can use that exaggerated adjective. So we're coming almost to the end of the session. So what I'm going to do is, I promised you that I would share some things that I've used for my own development and for the development of the students who pass through my life trying to learn communication skills. Now, my favorite is TED Talks. These are all over YouTube, if you're familiar with these. For verbal communication, presentation styles, speaking without breaks, TED Talks are the best. I will encourage you to look at TED Talks by Toastmasters. What is Toastmasters? This is an international organization which has a lot of clubs and sub-clubs in the UAE, by the way. They have smaller clubs all over the world, no matter which country you go to. And this club is a membership club where you can become members and then practice effective speaking and effective writing skills, which means you write your speeches for a project and then you present it to your home club. And the club members are very supportive because everyone comes from a different culture, and then they give each other constructive feedback. Little things like, you could have stood like this today, you could have held the paper this way today, you could have raised your voice today, you could have walked around the room today. Or I belong to an online club, and if people in this session are interested, I'll be very happy to share details of that online club meetup. We do meet twice a month, and then you can come and see what the activities are like. But this is a club that gives you the confidence to be able to speak without pauses, without breaks. One of my biggest achievements has been well, people, when they speak, and if it's not a prepared speech, a lot of the time they say, so I am, I was thinking of, so you see a lot of empty fillers in their speeches where they go, and that is very common in a lot of people who make public speeches. So my own personal achievement has been that that's significantly reduced in my speech, and I can make speeches to a large extent without sitting on that filler board. And a lot of people who I've introduced to this way of speaking also say the same thing. So if you were to use any of these two resources, I would encourage you to look up TED Talks on YouTube that are by distinguished Toastmasters, because they're the distinguished Toastmasters are the highest level of professional speakers, and they've spent years doing this. Then another thing that I've discovered is Coursera. Coursera started a series of free online courses during COVID-19, but at the moment, they still have numerous free courses on business communication skills, professional communication skills, professional writing skills. So you might want to go and look at some of those. Oh, this is my favorite. For those of you who live in the Middle East or the UAE, this is a radio channel that talks about local news. Why is this my favorite? Because there are presenters and hosts on programs from different cultures, and they speak English with a rather neutral accent. So it's not something that you can't understand. In fact, you can also install the app on your mobile phone, no matter where in the world you are, and you can still listen to their morning news. And that morning news is a couple of hours long because they spend time from 6 to 10 in the morning talking about things that are going on around the world. It's pleasant to listen to because their accents are neutral. Another one of my favorites is the Khaleej Times. This is a local newspaper for those of you who do not live in this country. They have a phone app that you can install. And then the reason why I recommend this to students or to adult learners who are trying to improve their communication style is that the more you listen, the better you're able to speak, or your vocabulary increases as well. So this app allows you to open up a news article, and then there is a speaker icon on the app, so you click on it. So while you're reading it, you can also listen to it. So it's kind of effective in helping you practice how to pronounce things. And this is what I want to say at the end. Gen Z logo or lingo, the language that the modern millennials or the youngsters use, please avoid that. That is not meant for professional communication. Recently, I've seen some Instagram posts where people say a word and the modern Gen Z learners or youngsters would use the word in a completely different way, which has no connection to the word. So that is modern day slang. That is not meant for effective communication. Remember, the goal of communication is to be able to say or write things that are understood by the person you're saying or writing to. It's not to look fancy with an amazing accent or with all the fancy words. You know, that is not the goal of communication. So that is a practical toolbox. And if you haven't already taken a screenshot, I will ask our team to share this with you. And so here are some of the resources that I'm recommending for reading online. These are not books because these days people don't really read books. And if you have any questions, I am here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Naziha. It has been an amazing workshop, and I hope everyone has got all the information, because I can see a lot of them that have actually had a lot of questions. But unfortunately, due to the time constraint, I'm just going to limit the questions to a few of them, if you don't mind, Doctor. One of the questions, which I feel is actually very interesting, it's I lose my confidence level while communicating with others. It makes me confused. So what would you advise them, Doctor?
Well, confidence comes with practice. So I'm assuming this question refers to verbal communication. When you communicate with others, you lose your confidence. One of the things you can do is, and again, I'm sharing a tip that I've practiced myself. This is days of less technology a couple of years ago. When I wanted to speak something in public, I would switch on my WhatsApp, record myself speaking, and then sometimes I did this while I was driving, and then finish the recording and listen back to what I'd said. And then sometimes I felt I didn't sound right. Sometimes I felt I wasn't using the right word, and that helped me adapt it in many ways. What you can do is, that's where I'll suggest the model of Toastmasters. What you can do is start, if it's a speech that you're preparing for or a presentation, you might want to practice with very close friends. Or another suggestion is try and continually use the language that you will be using to communicate with other people. And maybe that is the reason you lose confidence. So the more you use the language, the more you hear yourself speak, the better you will get at it. There's no other way about it.
Amazing, amazing, Doctor. This is very true, in fact. Another questions. In fact, doctor, we've been receiving a lot of feedback on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram. So I can see, in fact, the questions are increasing. So I'm just gonna try to give a few questions to give advice for the attendees. There is another question, is like, I've been facing problems regarding the communication, and I find myself less interactive in English as I'm not native to it. So what should I do? What are the steps to break this barrier?
Now, this is a linguistic question, a linguistic ability question, and I always make a disclaimer at the start of presentations related to business communication. English is not our native language, and therefore we need to use certain tips and techniques. Some of the tools that I showed on the previous slide are the ones that I always recommend. In the last few years, I've recommended them to groups of individuals whose first language is not English and therefore they struggle to speak. It's natural. I mean, I can't speak French, I can't speak Arabic, so I would be in the same situation as you are. The way to go about is to take baby steps. You can't do everything in one go. You might want to start by visiting some of the online Toastmasters clubs for free as a guest. You might want to start by listening to TED Talk speakers, but don't get intimidated. They're not there suddenly. They spend 7 to 10 years getting to that position. And you might want to use some of the tips I suggested in my response to the previous question. Listen to yourself speak. The more you listen to yourself speak, the better you will be able to improve the way you speak.
Amazing, amazing, doctor. Another interesting question. How do you approach and resolve conflicts in a professional setting?
That's a tricky question. One, I'm sitting in a seat in a professional setting. Now, if this, I'm going to respond to this in a with a link to communication, which is the reason why we are here today. Now, do you remember that slide I showed you on emotional intelligence? A lot of conflict in the workplace is unnecessary and can be resolved on the spot if both parties practice emotional intelligence. The basic approach would be to acknowledge how the other person feels. If you're the party who has not initiated the conflict and the other party has initiated it, there is no reason to react. The emotional intelligence encourages people to respond and not react. There's a big difference between the two. So a response would indicate that you've listened, you've acknowledged how they feel, then you let them know how you feel, and then you say, I understand, and this is what I would like to say, and then let the other party respond as well. And if you feel it's not going anywhere, you stop the conversation at that point and say, we will talk about this at another time, and then come back when both parties are feeling a little cooler and hopefully practicing a little bit of emotional intelligence. I've noticed that people who are stronger on emotional intelligence techniques often are able to manage the entire situation better. Hope that helps.
Of course, doctor. Thanks for the advice. One interesting question as well. As a student aspiring to become a leader, what are some key skills or experiences they should focus on developing now to prepare for future leadership roles?
My top suggestion to that question is active listening and communicative speaking. That's it. There's no list of things you need to do in order to prepare for leadership. So you might want to work on, first of all, active listening. Very important. Most of us are always only listening to 10% of what is being said, and the reason is because we're distracted. We're not practicing active listening. And then the second thing you will need to practice is how to communicate effectively. Communication doesn't always mean PowerPoint slides and you talking. I've trained people encouraging them to just bring their bodies and start presenting without PowerPoint, and that takes a lot of courage and effort. So communication, verbal. listening actively, and by all means, go and educate yourself on emotional intelligence and how that can be implemented in a professional context. That will be the biggest asset you will take towards developing yourself for a leadership role in the future.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I mean, it was very helpful. It's very interested. I'm interested myself in it.
Same here.
It's basically a day-to-day routine and scenarios that someone should be doing on a daily basis to even get better and improve and enhance. So, just to give the last 5 minutes, just to give you a little bit about GBS as well to everyone who is listening. So, GBS Dubai is a UK institution. We've been in the UK for it's been 14 years. We have campuses in London, Manchester, Leeds, and Birmingham. We have a campus in Dubai. We're based in Dubai Knowledge Park. And for the international students who also want to see our campus, you will also be seeing. You can actually have a virtual tour. You'll find it in the chat. With that being said, you can just go in and scroll around and look at our campus. We also have other universities that are abroad in the US, in the UK, in Australia, in France and Germany. So we are a big group, which basically is global education. If you or any of your family members want to pass by to the campus, want to get to know more information, we also have programs, practical learning more than in theory basis, which we believe is what is required in today's world. Just to wrap it up, I just wanted to thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, Dr. Naziha. And for all of you who was asking me about the certificates, you'll be receiving the certificates via email, automated, that it will be done. And then also, if you have any questions, our contact details will be mentioned. You can definitely reach out to us and we'll be very happy to assist you. Thank you very much to you all, and thank you so much, Dr. Naziha, for your time.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.